Of all the treatments on display here, the shock treatments are among the most mysterious and the most speculative. This goes right back to their origins. When psychiatrists talked about shock in the 1930s and early 1940s, they had two things in mind: insulin-induced comas, hyperglycemic shock, and convulsive therapies using chemicals or electricity. Insulin-induced comas were the brainchild of the Viennese neurophysiologist and psychiatrist Manfred Sarkel, but he was following in the footsteps of others. The ideas of using insulin to treat psychotic patients have been around since the hormone had been identified in 1922. For the 1920s were a time of great experimentation in psychiatry, where different methods were deployed speculatively. This was partly off the back of Wagner Jaureg's success in treating tertiary syphilis with malaria. Sarkel may have become aware of these currents flowing through European psychiatry. On top of that, during a spell in the early 1930s working in a Berlin clinic, Sarkel had used insulin coma to help morphine addicts recover from their addictions. He later claimed that this was a major stimulus to his development of the therapy. It was 1934 when he first used and then developed on the fly insulin coma therapy, which he christened a shock therapy, because insulin causes the liver and muscles to remove glucose from the blood, thus causing coma through hypoglycemic shock. A deeply paranoid patient was admitted to the Viennese clinic where Sarkel worked. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and Sarkel started treating him with insulin, the second dose placing the man into shock. When he woke from the dose, he was rational, but relapsed. He was again put in a coma with a series of injections, a regime that continued for over 2 weeks. But in the third week, the patient experienced a violent epileptic fit. Sarkel initially wanted to see if the fit would stop, but then decided to terminate it by injecting glucose, which brought the patient round again, who after a brief period of amnesia became lucid and with, as Shorter and Healy put it, complete insight into the pathological nature of his previous behaviour. Small insulin injections continued over the following weeks, not enough to comatose the patient, who remained lucid and was soon released cured. It was hypoglycemic shock, moderated by glucose, not the use of insulin, that was the innovation. And Sarkel trialled it upon a few select patients in the early 1930s. Being a Jew in Vienna was not a good thing by the mid-1930s, with the threat of a Nazi takeover and a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the German lands. So Sarkel became part of the Jewish diaspora, moving to the USA, where his ideas were taken up and integrated into asylum practice in the late 1930s. Sarkel's treatment was the first of 3 new therapies. The other 2 were closely related: cardiazol shock and electroconvulsive shock. Ladislas Meduna, an Austro-Hungarian neuropathologist, noticed in 1926 a difference in the structure of the brains of epileptics and schizophrenics at autopsy. "I accepted the concept of a biological antagonism between the 2 diseases," he said. Then, in 1929, he found out from his colleagues Julius Nairo and Albin Jablonski that while this antagonism did not really exist, it appeared that once a patient with epilepsy developed schizophrenia, their epileptic symptoms tended to dissipate. This resulted in the second in a chain of speculations. If epilepsy could be mitigated by schizophrenia, was it then possible that schizophrenia might be mitigated by epilepsy? So Meduna kept digging, finding conflicting clinical accounts, but always weighted towards some form of moderated antagonism. According to Shorter and Healy, it was a report by Alfred Glaus that impressed Meduna the most. Gauss knew that epilepsy and schizophrenia could coexist in the same individual, but he also had evidence that the two conditions tended to alternate. In other words, you couldn't suffer from schizophrenia and epilepsy at the same time. So the task became to develop a method of inducing an artificial epileptic fit in schizophrenics. But how to achieve this? Sure, you could electrocute people using the Faradaic apparatus that we saw in the first module. But this apparatus could not induce a fit, and Meduna didn't even think about this possibility. Instead, he focused upon camphor, which was known to produce fits. His first patient, a catatonic schizophrenic, was cured using a drug derived from the camphor laurel tree. To some degree, Meduna got lucky. It turns out that catatonia responds rather well to fits. However, he soon replaced camphor with cardiazol or metrazole, a drug that had been introduced in the 1920s. He was attempting to sidestep an issue that emerged with his first group of patients. The camphor took time to work, and during that period, the patients waited in dread for the onset of the fit. Unfortunately, cardiazol did not solve that problem either. Nevertheless, the early results were highly encouraging. Of the initial 26 patients treated with camphor, 10 were remissions, 3 had showed temporary improvement, while the rest were unchanged. This might appear a modest success, but in terms of treating such an intractable condition, it looked like a major breakthrough. In his monograph on the use of cardiazol-metrazole published in 1937, he reported that 110 patients had been treated with an improved remission rate of 50%. A stunning success, it would appear, although these statistics were questionable and were rarely provable. Others were not able to achieve the same high rate of success as either Sarkel or Meduna. But cardiazol was a much safer form of treatment than insulin coma, not least because in the latter you were taking the patient to the brink of death and keeping her there for a very long time. When this method was used again in deep sleep therapy by the deep patterners like Ewan Cameron, the mortality rate was unacceptably high. Cardiazol, on the other hand, was a short, sharp and safe treatment. Ugo Ciletti, trained in the mind-brain school of neuropathological thinking, had studied under Nissl and Alzheimer, the outstanding neuropathologists of their day, and was interested in epilepsy. And he wanted to know whether epilepsy involved histological changes in the area of the brain called the hippocampus. So working on dogs, he decided that he needed to induce fits in them in a non-toxic way. The physiologist Gaetano Viala suggested that electrocution would do the job well. Apparently quite a lot of physiologists use this method. So he electrocuted a lot of dogs. In other words, he attempted to induce artificial epilepsy through electric shock. If the dog survived the shock and had a convulsion, he'd kill it and then dissect its brain to see if he could spot any fit-induced lesions. Quite a lot of dogs died, however, before they convulsed. This was down to the method of electrocution. Electrodes were placed in the dog's mouth and anuses. A shock was given, which sometimes resulted in heart attacks, the electric impulse reaching the heart before the brain and mucking up the heart's electrochemistry. Dog heart attack equals no dog fit. One of his assistants, Binny, came up with the idea of applying the electrical current directly to the head, which seemed to work really well once they'd figured out the dosage. The dogs passed out instantaneously and routinely fitted on demand. During this period, Ciletti became aware of Meduna's research in all its ragged glory. Thinking about the problems that Meduna had with the dread his patients faced waiting for the onset of shock, he thought to himself, why doesn't he use electricity? He was also aware that he had to get this right. Electricity had a bad rap, not least because of its use in executions in the USA. So in 1936, Ciletti and his team went about developing a convulsive therapy using electric shock. The effort that went into constructing the equipment and working out the doses was considerable. Trips to the slaughterhouse, where animals were stunned with electricity before being slaughtered, were highly instructive. So they decided to do more experiments on pigs to work out a safe dosage, gradually moving towards what would be safe for a human. In April 1938, the police brought in a seemingly homeless man who was suffering the symptoms of schizophrenia. Enrico X was the pseudonym given him in the account of the first application of electroconvulsive therapy. A week later, they decided to try again. This time they went straight to a high dosage, 92 volts for half a second. To gain an insight into what happened, again I resort to the description of Shorter and Healy. The patient responded with a general tonic spasm, then clonic contractions of the limbs and trunk that lasted for about 80 seconds, followed by a period of 105 seconds in which he did not breathe. Binney counted out loud the duration of the apnea. The patient ejaculated semen, which is not uncommon in a grand mal convulsion, as is also spontaneous loss of urine. Enrico's face became quite cyanotic, pale, and corneal reflexes were absent, indicating a state of unconsciousness. After 4 to 5 minutes, Enrico began to move his head and limbs and to open his eyes, but he did not respond to questions or stimuli. His Babinski reflex was positive and abnormal, reflecting a change in brain signals to the limbs. A normal Babinski means turning the big toe downward in response to tickling the sole of the foot. 10 minutes after its induction, the convulsion ceased, and he seems partly to have regained consciousness. About 3 minutes later, he started to respond to questions and to carry out simple instructions. Another 2 minutes after that, he began to speak, stating that he remembered nothing. When he was shown the electrodes and asked if he wished to repeat the experiment, he was completely indifferent. Perhaps as many as 10 treatments were given over the next couple of weeks, by which time the patient was deemed to have recovered. However, his usefulness to Ciletti had not ended. He was presented to the Royal Academy of Medicine in Rome, where Ciletti gave a paper, A New Method of Shock Therapy, electroshock. To make the point more forcefully, Enrico was wheeled out and shocked in front of the astonished audience. Another patient was dosed with cardizole. It was a very theatrical performance, and the audience was able to see with their own eyes which of the two methods was better. In June, Enrico returned home, apparently cured, although 2 years later his wife would write to Ciletti asking for assistance following her husband's admission to one of the local Milanese hospitals. Ciletti did not reply. The cure, it appeared, had been temporary, but by this time the astonishing career of ECT had taken off. Over the years that followed, all three of the shock therapies were conveyed around the world and were used in hospitals and clinics. Sometimes patients received all three in succession. But during the 1940s, cardiazole therapy faded away in the face of the more effective nature of electroshock treatment, while insulin coma became restricted to the highly dangerous deep sleep therapies used on schizophrenics. ECT, as it became acronymically known, became the major treatment for all psychotic conditions, but especially for depressive disorders. Right the way into the 1960s and the beginning of the era of psychopharmacology, ECT remained a potent weapon in the psychiatrist's arsenal. Although there were issues around dosages, particularly the length and extent of a course of treatment, and many psychoanalysts were disturbed by it. So, for example, when Lang and Esterson recruited a cohort of young women for their study into madness in the family, they would not recruit anyone who had received more than 50 electroshocks in the year before the investigation began, and not more than 150 in all. But the practice was widely adopted throughout asylums, and it was perceived to be highly beneficial by most psychiatrists. We can see the psychological effect that it had in this quote: "Without ECT, I would not have lasted out in psychiatry." Clearly, this practitioner felt that it had deeply beneficial effects upon the patients. And today, it continues to be used in intractable cases of depression. Shorter's quote reminds us of this fact. and as well that it was one of the first really successful methods of ameliorating mental suffering, and of course that we still don't know how it works, which is probably why it is viewed with such dread and horror. Despite its success, the wider world has never been able to see anything other than a barbaric treatment that represents, along with the lobotomy, the full horror of psychiatric therapy. From an epistemological point of view, there is also this issue. It started out as a means of inducing epilepsy, as an antagonist to schizophrenia, but became a major treatment for clinical depression. Such is the nature of the therapeutic gap and the development of effective therapies. To summarise, the questions I'd like you to think about are: how fair is it to regard ECT with horror when case after case seem to indicate improvements in the patients? And therefore, was it really as barbaric as has been made out? The answers to these questions are not simple, and I won't give them here. That it should not possess the cultural horror that it does is a challenging view for all of us who were brought up on Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or more pertinently, Foreman's film adaptation of the book. Here it is worth recalling that by the time Jack Nicholson put in his Oscar-winning performance as McMurphy, ECT was past its heyday, replaced with a battery of psychopharmacological products.